If you are a public servant and you work at a Department of Transportation or you're an elected official, your job is to serve the people, not just the people who have the means and resources and linguistic capabilities and accessible options to show up at your meeting. Your job is to serve the whole community. And so we don't have to get to them. They have to start realizing that we're just as important in coming to us.
Good morning. I'm Bob Seay from WGBH News, and I'd like to welcome you to the second of our transit-oriented development talks being presented in conjunction with MassINC and also the WGBH Forum Network. And the recent protest around the world, restating that Black Lives Matter, has ignited conversations about racism everywhere. And today we're going to turn to the world of transportation and specifically bicycling. But before we do that, let's take a few seconds just to remember those who have lost their lives in public spaces in recent weeks. This morning, I'd like to welcome our guest, Tracy Corley, MassINC's Transit-Oriented Development Fellow, who has organized this series. Good morning, Tracy.
Good morning.
And from Los Angeles, we have Tamika Butler. We welcome Tamika to the program this morning. Now, for those of you joining us, we certainly invite you to ask questions. You can submit your questions to the Q&A part of the presentation. And we also have 3 poll questions for you this morning. And we'd like to start out with number 1 here. Have you ever experienced harassment from strangers or been stopped by law enforcement while cycling? And what race do you identify as? And we'd like to have your responses to those questions, and we'll give you the results in just a few moments. But I'd like to begin this morning's program. When I first heard about this subject, I was a bit surprised. Racism in bicycling, and it seemed to me something I had never heard about. And so what I think we should do is to turn to our guests this morning to begin by hearing some of their personal stories about experiencing racism while cycling. And Tracy, shall we begin with you?
Yeah, I think I want to just say good morning to everyone. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, we're having this conversation today to talk about, what it's like for people of color as they're moving through public spaces, especially in cycling, because a lot of the conversations that have been had about how we think about a cycling infrastructure and what type of resources and policies are needed, a lot of it doesn't take into account some of the experiences that Black people have when they're riding bikes. I know that as a Black person who rides around Boston, and I have been riding around the cities I've lived in, both here in the United States, in Seattle before this, as well as in Germany, that, being on a bicycle, you have to be very conscious of just how people are going to approach you. I remember when I first moved here to Massachusetts, I was actually staying in Malden and wound up doing a bike ride out to Revere Beach. And I was just shocked at just how aggressive people were, heckling you. I actually had one guy in a car give me the finger. And I think he thought, because I didn't react, I think he thought that I didn't see him. And so he made sure to use his other hand and stick it out the window to make sure that I saw, him giving me the finger. And it's and those are kind of just minor incidences. But I also have experienced issues where people are just driving aggressively, deliberately opening doors as you're cycling by. And then also being a woman, just also the cat calls you get while you're also on a bicycle. But I also had some experiences in Germany. I found it was very endemic, I guess you can say, that being on the trains with a bicycle, even though I had a pass that allowed me to take my bicycle on any train in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, the officials would always stop me and tell me, "Oh, you can't have your bicycle here." And they would just harass me, and it just got to the point where I just pretended like I didn't speak German, just so I wouldn't have to deal with it. And I can now understand why people here in the United States, there are people who are bi or multilingual, pretend like they don't speak English just because they're just tired of the harassment. And these are the everyday microaggressions we have to deal with.
And Tamika, you have actually written about this issue quite a bit. What has been your experience out in Los Angeles?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Bob, on this very early morning for a West Coaster.
Welcome.
And you're right, I have written about this issue a lot. I used to be the executive director of the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition. Most recently, I was at a planning transportation firm, Tool Design, where we specialized in biking and walking projects. And now I'm the principal and founder of my own consulting firm, Tamika L Butler Consulting. And so through all of those jobs, I have both had my own personal experiences, and I've had experiences that I've heard from friends and members and constituents from the different organizations I've had. And what I always tell people is that many folks who ride bikes might say, well, I've had the same experience as Tracy. Like, I've had people open doors on me. I've had people yell at me when they didn't see me riding on my bike. And I think the difference is, and this is hard, I think, sometimes for people to understand, and particularly non-people of color, non-Black folks, that threat feels different when you are inhabiting a Black body, when the slur that is yelled is the N-word. I have a ton of white guy friends who ride bikes, and they'll get stopped by cops, and all of us who ride bikes know that the cops will say, well, the law says blah 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 blah, and oftentimes we know the law better than them. And my white friends feel perfectly safe mouthing off to the cop. And mouthing off doesn't mean being rude and cussing, just being like, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, officer, but that's not actually what the law says, which is something I just don't have the privilege to do as a Black person because I could be dead. And then I think the other piece is, I'm privileged, and I can acknowledge my privilege. I went to Stanford Law School. I have a wife who's a partner at a law firm and makes a lot of money, and so I have a nice bike. And I get asked constantly if the bike is mine. When I get stopped, when people ask me questions, where did you get that bike from? Hey, are you supposed to be here? And our bike coalition office in downtown Los Angeles was just a block away from Skid Row. And every time I would be riding my bike, there would often be people who would assume that I stole it, or that I didn't belong in downtown as a professional. And in fact, the folks who treated me the kindness and welcomed me the most were the people experiencing homelessness, who saw me as a community member and a neighbor, but not the trendy hipster, white folks who had moved downtown and wonder why I was riding around on some stolen bike. So I think all of those things happen to people of color, and for people who it doesn't happen to, the hardest thing for them to do is to believe something could be real just because it hasn't happened to them. And the reality is we have different experiences when we are Black, and we need folks to believe us.
And before we get to our first question results, or we can go there right now, you can all see them. Have you ever experienced harassment from strangers or been stopped by law enforcement? 16% said no, and they weren't cyclists. 11% said no, and I do not know anyone who has. 18% said no, but I know someone who has. 2%, yes, but I don't know of anyone else who has. And then 54% says yes, and I know someone else who has. So a majority of people have experienced harassment from strangers or been stopped by law enforcement while cycling. That's of our guests this morning here in our program. And of our guests this morning, 76% are white, 8% are Black, 5% are non-white Hispanic. So out of that, we do have a majority of people who've had the same experience. We turn to you, Alex. Alex Weck, who is joining us from Springfield, originally from Minnesota. He moved to Somerville and has been working in Roxbury, Lawrence, and has been in Springfield for the past 5 years, doing a series of projects, including the R.A.D Springfield Community Bike Project to promote access to bike repair, acquisition, and education. Even though you obviously are white, you have been involved in equity issues in transportation, and specifically when you were in Lawrence and also out there in Springfield. Tell us about your experience.
I will be outspoken about the fact that I am indeed a white male, and while we do not deal with as much of what I refer to as otherization of folks with, Black bodies, female bodies, LGBTQ bodies, deal with a lot more otherization. But being a cyclist is one world in which, people, especially white men, sometimes do feel this tiny little sense of otherization. If you lump all those things together, like Tracy and Tamika have spoken, you're dealing with just a huge aggregate of prejudice against individuals that was potentially result in somebody feeling they needed to stick their hand out the window and flick you off. And that's a relatively minor impact relative to some of the things that I've seen on the streets here in Springfield. I work with a lot of youth, a lot of homeless individuals, and quite simply here in Springfield, we live in a world where bike is still a four-letter word. It's easy in Boston to, not really think past 495 or maybe to Worcester, or maybe you get out west every once in a while, but Springfield's almost like it's beyond Jupiter in some ways, beyond Pluto. We're a different world, but with over 30,000 Black individuals and a very sizable Latino population here, we're maybe off the radar in some senses, but experience unbelievable prejudice on the streets every day. And we can get into that a little bit more with some of the questions, but it's important for everybody in Massachusetts to remember the gateway cities that exist outside of some of their orbits when we talk about these things, because there are a large number of cities that experience very real and sometimes isolated situations of unbelievable injustice when it comes to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, Bob, I think it might be a good time to bring up just that we have a slide to kind of just show some of the demographics as to kind of what's happening in our gateway cities, because for people who are joining us today, our Gateway Cities Innovation Institute is the one who's kind of putting together this transformative, trans-oriented development initiative. And we do focus on the gateway cities. And as you can see here, if you think about the state of Massachusetts, around 28 or to 29% of the population are people of color. But in our gateway cities, that average is 41%, which is up from 33% back in 2010. And so you can kind of see the range here from this chart as to just kind of, what the populations are and how diverse the gateway cities are. Of course, Springfield is in there, but the most people of the city with the most people of color happens to be Lawrence, where it's a little over almost 86% of the population are people of color. And so, and because we tend to have more people of color living in our gateway cities, which I always like to emphasize they're cities, not towns, and they're just smaller cities, not as big as Boston, but they are urbanized areas. They do tend to attract a lot of immigrants as well as people of color, which means you have a lot more of some of the dynamics as to kind of how people of color are moving through public spaces. And so, which, as we talk about, what that looks like, Tamika, you brought this up, I think we have a tendency, and we're just conditioned this way as a nation, to think about people of color as being older than they actually are. We tend to treat young people of color, particularly Black boys, but also just Black boys and girls, as well as boys and girls of color. We tend to treat them as adults. We tend to treat them as if they're older than they actually are. And we do have a problem with hypercriminalization of assuming that if we do see Tamika riding her bike, really nice bike, in a professional, in the business district, then, oh, that bike must be stolen. That's kind of the first thing that we jump to. And a lot of that has to do with just biases. And so we need to really address that. And so I would really like for us to kind of just talk a little bit more about that, and maybe have Tamika jump in and kind of talk to us a little bit more about equity, and then have Alex kind of bring us back to kind of some of the equity concerns that are kind of going on in Springfield right now.
Well, how do we address that? And maybe we can turn to Tamika for what are some of the strategies to try to get people to understand, how they're behaving and how to do something to affect that behavior.
So I think, we have to first just acknowledge that it's happening. And frankly, we should really be past awareness. When people say, I just had no idea or I just didn't know, that really can no longer be acceptable. Yesterday would have been Tamir Rice's birthday. And as Tracy said, this was a young Black boy who was perceived as a man. And you know, his life was taken too soon. And there are countless stories like that of little Black boys and little Black girls and older Black boys and Black girls, you know, adults, women and men whose lives are taken too soon. And I think part of what happens with equity is it gets tough, right? Because now everyone's saying equity, 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 and talking about the fact that we need equity. But the reality is a lot of people don't know what we mean by equity. So when folks think of equity, sometimes they think of that picture of people looking over a fence, right? Where you give everybody the same box to look over the fence. And and if you just do it equally, then the short person still can't see over the fence. And equity is when you give people what they need. And in an even simpler form, the folks who have historically had the least will get the most. And so some of those neighborhoods in the gateway cities that maybe have less infrastructure, less investment, maybe they need more. And that's really hard when you're talking about transportation or when you're talking about any policy, because it's hard for elected officials to step up and say, I'm going to tell my constituents we've had it good for long enough. Like we should do it differently. And so equity conversations actually often get turned into geographic equality conversations. And that's really, really unhelpful. This picture is also just super outdated and just unrealistic. It doesn't show that some people are actually starting at a disadvantage because of systematic racism and white supremacy. It doesn't show that some people are starting off way ahead. And it's fraught because equity doesn't get to the root of what we should be talking about, which is power and privilege. And so I was part of, you know, a collective, and I think we have a slide on power and privilege. I was part of a collective that went to Salzburg, Austria. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation sits us out there, and we really talked about the fact that equity is sometimes distracting because people aren't even knowing what you're talking about, right? And so why do you want me to tear down the fence? Who's decided that the baseball game is the thing I want to watch? What if I want to play in the game? What if I want to coach the game? What if I want to be the umpire? What if I want to sell peanuts in the stand? What if I want to own the team? It's still an image that is based on, you know, folks in power saying, this is what you should want to do, watch a baseball game, and this is what you should be fighting for, to look over the fence. But it's not actually taking down the fence. It's not actually just giving you full access. And that's really important when we talk about transportation and when we talk about mobility, because it is about moving freely. It's about no matter what body you inhabit, no matter who you are, if you're a person with a disability, if you're a person who is trans, that you should feel comfortable moving freely. And that we all have to acknowledge that though there are certain people who have been in power historically and putting up those fences, we're all on stolen land. This is indigenous land that we're all inhabiting. And so we've taken their ability to move freely, and now we're trying to take that ability from other people. And so we have to be willing to confront the privilege that some of us have when we, you know, if this doesn't affect us personally, we don't think it's a problem. And we have to think who has the power in these situations, who's defining the rules, who's saying who can go where and who can't go where, who's criminalizing when certain people decide to act in space in different ways. When a woman who is tired from a long day of work says, nah, not today, I don't want to get up and go back to the bus. Or when somebody is jogging in a neighborhood that people don't think they belong in, who is really enforcing and who has the power? Who's getting left behind? And those are the questions, you know, power and privilege that we have to confront. And if we want to confront them, we have to be brave because it's uncomfortable. And we've had this culture that says we want to be in safe spaces. But the reality is, as a Black woman who is gender nonconforming, who many people see as a Black man, there are very few spaces where I feel safe. There are very few spaces where I look around and there are a lot of people that act like me. So to be my authentic self, I have to be brave every single day. And so what we're asking is for people who have that privilege, who don't have to think about things because it doesn't affect them, they have to be brave enough to analyze it and challenge it and to really think about the power at play in certain situations.
Yeah.
You know, we any of us who do bike realize that there are aggressions, even for those of us who ride maybe slower bikes than some of the people on faster bikes. There's a lot of conflict, and some of it comes down to infrastructure, where we are riding, and we're put in the paths of other people and vehicles, and sometimes. So I'd like to generally ask a question about bike infrastructure, and maybe Alex, you can join us talking about this, especially in communities of color or gateway cities. Is there bike infrastructure that is really safe that could minimize some of this aggressive behavior?
Short answer is no here in Springfield. We've suffered from decades and decades of urban planning that has focused on getting folks in to downtown Springfield, which is sort of the core of the culture and the diversity of Springfield's population. Our urban planning system has focused on getting cars from the suburbs, from the people of power, the white flight generations of the past who all moved out to the suburbs, focusing on getting them into the city, into our central business district, and back out. While also within the past 70 years, steamrolling much of downtown Springfield to put in the Interstate 91 corridor. These are scenarios that have happened in diverse communities throughout the country. And the most significant thing that we deal with here in Springfield goes along with the fence analogy that Tamika was bringing up, that we live right on the Connecticut River here. All of the 3 bridges that go across the river here in Springfield have absolutely no bike facilities incorporated in their design. So it's essentially a walled off area where people might be able to bike with some level of comfort. And I will credit our planning department here in Springfield for improving since I've been here in the past 5 years. But this is really a state issue where MassDOT controlled bridges do not incorporate any ability for folks to walk or bike over bridges, essentially redlining the whole city of Springfield from a transportation perspective. So these are big statewide issues that we want people, within 495 to hear about and think about in their own state.
We did have a question submitted to us from Marcia, who asked, why are there so few bike racks in the Black community, which is another kind of infrastructure question. Tracy or Tamika, would you like to comment on that?
It's really a question of, once again, we think about, power and privilege, but, when it comes to public policy and kind of, how we choose to invest in communities, we know that Black communities and communities of color just don't get the kinds of resources that, your typical more upper class white communities get. Even if we kind of think about like the open streets programs that are happening right now, the real focus has been on kind of helping restaurants, put their, tables out in the streets and in public spaces at the expense of actually, closing off sidewalks for people who need to walk in those communities, people who need to walk to transit to get to, essential services and get to essential jobs, people who need to bike in these communities, as well as for businesses who aren't necessarily serving people who are going to restaurants right now. Because keep in mind that, if you're only opening up space for one type of business that serves one type of customer, think about all those families right now who can't afford to go to restaurants. Think about all those families right now who with COVID-19 can't even afford to buy groceries. We are hearing about record numbers of people like lining up for food banks, but there's really no place for them to go to actually find food. And so, but we're privileging, how we use our public space for opening up for restaurants. What does that mean for communities of color, especially communities of color? We know that, for example, I talk about this a lot. The city of Chelsea has the highest rate of COVID-19 infection, in the state, and transmission and infection in the state. And it's also one of the, not necessarily the densest community, but is the most crowded community because people cannot afford to have housing that is adequate for the number of people who live in those units. It's just the cost of housing here in Massachusetts is so high. And so, we think about, communities of color, we think about the lack of adequate, sidewalks, we think about the lack of adequate green spaces, and just, bike infrastructure is just another, layer on this kind of cake of inequities, I guess you can say,
Mhm.
of, of just, one of those kind of pieces, but I think, it's not only about, having bike racks, it's also about having the bike lanes. It's about having places where people can actually go to repair their bikes. It's about having, places to purchase bikes and to get your bikes repaired. I remember living in Roxbury. I can't think of a single bike shop that was in the city, in the neighborhood of Roxbury. I've got one here in JP, and of course, if I'm downtown, I have a couple to choose from. A lot in Cambridge, but it's definitely, we need to be thinking about what kinds of businesses, what kinds of infrastructure, what kinds of social infrastructure we're bringing to our communities to make sure that we can facilitate people actually using public spaces, especially for biking.
Tamika, we think of Los Angeles and California as having plenty of room and space to develop transportation infrastructure. And what's happening out there? You have the same problems, even though you have more space than the old city of Boston or Springfield?
We definitely have the same problems, and we have the same problems because white supremacy and racism are undefeated. They live everywhere. They travel. They survive pandemics. There's a reason that Black folks are still dying and in public spaces throughout a pandemic, that we're dying at higher rates, right? Because racism doesn't give up, it doesn't end. And so I think LA is definitely a place where that is also true. And there was an article in the LA Times the other day that said, while we're taking down all these racist monuments, we should talk about the highway system. And so LA is a place that many people think of as very car centric, and highways are a big part of how we've destroyed low income communities of color, separated people, separated families. Being in transportation, you understand and practice literally what it means to be on the other side of the tracks, or the other side of the bridge, or the other side of the freeway, right? And so I think that no matter where you live, as Tracy said, part of the reason we have to approach this from an individual level. Like, as individuals, we all have to question power, privilege, and think about how equity, and frankly beyond that, anti-racism shows up in all of our work. But we can't stop on the individual level, because these problems are systematic. They're systematic in our budgets and our policies. And so the way we prioritize our money and the way we spend our money has really preferenced cars for a long time. But beyond that, it has preferenced folks with more means, more ability to go to public meetings, to speak up, to say we want more bike racks, to say we want more bike lanes. And so that is also true in the United States, and it's true in countries or in cities across the country, where you see that walking infrastructure, sidewalks, biking infrastructure, bike lanes are just reduced in low-income communities of color. And also, just like you see with COVID-19, where Black people and people of color are dying at higher rates, you see the same thing with traffic fatalities and serious injuries. You are more likely to be involved in traffic violence and be the victim of traffic violence if you are a person of color.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, and talking about, and policies, it's also in our development strategies, not just land use and property development, but also in economic development. I think we have a lot of times we think about economic development. I know, like, it's, again, working in the gateway cities, working really hard to try to improve those markets, but with a focus on kind of bringing in richer, wealthier people into the community. That focus ignores the people who already live in those communities and actually need better infrastructure to be able to use their communities more effectively. And so I think that, in addition to some of the other policies and ways that we fund things, we should be really thinking really hard and interrogating our economic development strategies to make sure we're being inclusive of the people who already live in our communities and just need better resources.
Our second polling question has to do with public space, and asks, how often have you experienced harassment in public spaces? We'd like our participants to weigh in on that question. We'll have the results for you in just a couple of minutes. Alex, you've been part of something called the R.A.D Springfield Community Bike Project. Tell us about your efforts there to try to increase the access and the ability for people to bike safely?
Certainly, Bob. When I moved to Springfield just over 5 years ago, I realized after having done a community bike project in Lawrence, Mass, one of the few communities that is has a larger non-white population than Springfield within the state of Massachusetts, I realized when moving to Springfield that there was no bike shop. Springfield is the largest city in New England without a commercial bike shop. And as Tracy mentioned, that's something that it occurs in the Boston neighborhood of Roxbury as well. This is raw racism in how businesses are promoted, how folks have disinvested in a lot of gateway cities throughout the state over the years. And everything that you think about in terms of racism in the public health sector can be applied to biking. Few bike racks, no bike shop. Recently, the mayor of Springfield, who's very much a known racist, refused the reinstallation of our bike share bikes in Springfield, whereas the cities of Northampton and the town of Amherst are getting their bike share facilities back. We deal with so many challenges here in Springfield that my focus with founding R.A.D 5 years ago was to do everything that we can to supply bicycles to anybody who wanted to ride. And we do that through a grassroots volunteer run setup where we're just a group of volunteers who like to work on bikes. We, under normal conditions, gather for public workshops, and we will get you a bike for free if you have no money to contribute. We do a sort of NPR style model of financing where give as you can, and we feel that bikes should be a public resource, that everybody should have access to a bicycle itself. That stems a little bit further away from the infrastructure discussion, which in addition to everybody getting a bike, we try and make sure that everybody has at least a bit of education to go with that. Why wearing a helmet is important, why lights are important, what is the the legal and proper way to ride. And one of the biggest things that we've come up against is the enforcement issue in communities of color. It's important to bring up that the fact that the police in Springfield do not know the laws of the streets, and that is enforced in a manner that is extremely racist and leads to people being followed, young men of color often being followed by cops unfairly. And so we've become a sort of community safe space for the bike life movement, for young men and women to come in and talk about what they're seeing on the streets. And we've really evolved into more of the community element of the community bike shop name. If you're not familiar with community bike shops, they're around in most cities of our size. Worcester Earn a Bike in Worcester. There's a Lowell Bike Project now. There are many options for folks out there in the gateway cities. But when I moved to Springfield, there was nothing going on, and I've just done my part with the privilege that I have to help everybody get biking.
And we've heard about the surge in bicycle purchases and ownership and ridership, so this becomes even more pressing issue. We have some results from our second poll question. How often have you experienced harassment in public places? 42% say rarely, 37% say occasionally, 8% frequently, and 13% never. In terms of access to bicycles, Stephen from Malden writes, Lime Bike was a big hit, especially with our lower income neighborhoods, but that program shut down and we don't have funding for the Blue Bike program. But he also puts a word in for the Gateway Cities program funding a major upgrade of the Northern Strand Trail, which runs through multiple environmental justice neighborhoods. So there's a good news, bad news message there. Tracy, do you want to comment on the Lime Bike, Blue Bike situation?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, we have, bike share programs, but once again, we talk about, the criminalization. You see people of color on bikes, and, and there's this kind of sometimes this implicit bias that, hey, does this person have this bike legally? Did they steal that bike? What's going on? And so as a result, if folks don't want to put bikes into communities of color. Now that said, I also happened to look at Greenville, South Carolina a few years ago, where they actually did a program of kind of helping to revitalize neighborhoods by putting in community centers and bike share facilities at these community centers in communities of color. But there was no biking infrastructure, and also there was no place to go. And so this kind of comes back to, kind of a broader question about just overall development. It's one thing to kind of put facilities in communities, but if the infrastructure isn't there so that people can bike safely, and this is more than just putting some paint on the pavement, this is really putting in protected bike lanes and places where people truly feel safe from drivers, as well as kind of helping to keep pedestrians safe and separated from cyclists as people are moving about the spaces. But also making sure that there are actually places to go. And this kind of like brings up, a bigger question around planning. If you have predominantly residential neighborhoods, or if you have communities where not only bike shops are disappearing, but also basic amenities like grocery stores, like libraries, like parks. If people don't have any place to actually ride those bikes, then sometimes those bike sharing programs just they don't get the level of use. And then someone had mentioned kind of about transportation takes a look at demand. If you're basing demand for services on existing conditions where it's not actually conducive for people to be able to use the service until the development happens, it does become a kind of a chicken and egg kind of conversation. We talk about this a lot at MassINC around the commuter rail system. It's like, well, we go where the population and the demand is. Well, the demand isn't there until you actually get the service up to the level it needs to be. From a broader planning perspective, there needs to be more of a conversation as to how can we make sure that we are encouraging a very diverse level of activity so that people have places to go once that actual infrastructure is there in place. And that's all, a lot of that also kind of comes back to actually involving people in the communities in the planning process. This can't be a top-down kind of conversation where someone is sitting in an office at MassDOT, at MassINC, or at any of our organizations deciding for a community what it needs. I think the programs like what Alex is running in Springfield, around R.A.D Springfield, having people actually participate in talking about what they really need in their communities and finding some way to bridge that power gap between the folks with the resources and the folks with the need. I think that plays a huge part into making sure that projects like Lime Bike and Blue Bikes are going to be successful, and also and actually making sure that we're funneling the resources into communities that need the most.
I totally
Matthew,
agree.
yeah,
I,
go ahead,
I was
Tamika.
gonna say I totally agree. And there is this idea that like part of the investment in places is because it's that's where people are riding, right? But what we've seen, and the League of American Bicyclists had put out a report that bicycling is actually increasing way more in communities of color than it is in white communities. I think I read a stat that said it was increasing 100% in Black communities. So this idea that Black and brown folks aren't biking, and that's why there's not infrastructure there because they're not using it, just isn't factually true. It's because they're there and they're Black and brown that resources aren't being invested there, because people aren't talking to those folks. As Tracy said, they're not engaging them. They're having meetings, that don't provide food, that don't provide childcare, that aren't linguistically appropriate, and they're coming in their neighborhoods that have many problems. They want the streetlights to work. They want to know why they don't have access to fresh food and groceries. They want to know why transit is always late in their community. And then people are coming in for the first time to talk about a bike lane. And it's not that they don't want bike lanes or that they wouldn't use them. It's that there is a level of mistrust and suspiciousness because government hasn't historically helped out communities like mine. And so that's where some of this is coming from, that we have to acknowledge that there's this false narrative that folks wouldn't use it, or that the data just isn't there. The data isn't there because who's collecting the data, right? And it's what Tracy said, this can't be top down. And it can't be top down because the transportation industry, like every other industry right now, that is being called out and questioning what the experience is like for people of color, our industry needs to realize, and not just transportation, but urban planning and land use professionals generally have to acknowledge that they have historically kept Black and brown folks out. They have historically kept people with disabilities out, women out, Indigenous folks out, queer folks out. And so we have all of these historically older white men sitting in rooms deciding how our cities and our neighborhoods and our communities and our rural areas are going to be planned without actually talking to people who have the most expertise, because the person sitting on the stoop or standing on the corner actually knows way more about the community than the person in an office miles away. But we don't think of those people as experts because they don't have the fancy degrees, they don't have the initials after their name, and so we don't value their opinion. And again, it's based in this idea of racism where we just don't trust people of color. We just don't see them as smart enough or educated enough to contribute, and we don't like to give them access to power because people who have historically had it fear that that would make them lose it. And so we have to talk about infrastructure, we have to talk about policies, we also have to talk about who are in the seats making the decisions, and we also have to acknowledge that there is a picture of George Floyd being killed that far too many of us have seen and been traumatized by. And one of my old colleagues, Eric Bruins, who now works for a council member in Los Angeles, Mike Bonin, who's perhaps one of, if not the best advocate for active transportation in Los Angeles, Eric tweeted that picture and said, look behind him, there's a green bike lane. And that didn't save his life. And so we have to both think about infrastructure, we have to think about money, we have to think about resources, but we also can't be afraid to talk about racism. And when people say, again, I just don't know, I haven't heard from the communities, what do the communities want? Or I've only heard from certain writers, people who are writing about this issue, I haven't heard about others. That's because you are making an affirmative choice to not go seek out that information. Because there are Black and brown people writing about this, talking about this, advocating about this. But if you feel like you've only seen certain people or certain perspectives, that's because you haven't taken the time to go out and look for it, to use the whole free internet, the Google, right? Because those of us who are Black, we have, I had to figure out what NPR was. I had to figure out these things my white colleagues were saying and doing, but white people don't have to do that because they have decided that they are normal and that they are the norm. And so you have to seek out these resources, and then you have to pay these folks for their time and their expertise because they're there.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say that this kind of talks about the broader question. We are a society that we like to base our policies on evidence, but we have prioritized quantitative data as the only type of valid evidence. And so people's lived experience is valid information, as well as we know that statistics can be manipulated. I remember sitting on a panel in Berlin with a group of economists talking about labor market issues. And I remember one of the panelists said, when it came to me doing my multiple regressions, which is a statistical process for analyzing data, he had to take out all of the women and people of color because it skewed his results. And, if it wasn't a public forum, I could have throttled him right then and there. But that just kind of really just kind of wraps up, the reason why we don't have the quote unquote demand or the evidence to show that people of color want the kinds of things that quote unquote white communities have, because this depends on really how you collect the data. And so spot on, Tamika. But, I think we need to be very open and honest about what constitutes as expertise, what constitutes as valid data, and that lived experiences. We need to seek out those stories. We need to seek out people's lived experiences and take them as truth.
And I know in Boston, when they, began to unveil their Safe Streets initiative and bike lanes and so forth, there was a question of, well, what's happening in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester? We need these same benefits there. And it was as if the same thing was happening in Boston. And I guess what you have to do, both Tamika and Tracy, is to make sure that you get to these people of power and make your case, right? So how is that done?
I don't know, Tamika, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I would argue that we don't have to get to the people.
Okay.
They need to get to us. That's literally their job. If you are a public servant and you work at a Department of Transportation or you're an elected official, your job is to serve the people, not just the people who have the means and resources and linguistic capabilities and accessible like options to show up at your meeting. Your job is to serve the whole community. And so we don't have to get to them. They have to start realizing that we're just as important in coming to us. And you know, my whole thing is we are in a country like founded on stealing people from my homeland, stealing land once you got here, stealing ideas, hoarding it, and then putting forth this false idea that we're pulling ourselves up from the bootstraps when in fact mediocrity has allowed you to pull yourself up by relying on people of color to build you up. And so people of color, when we want things, we're told, well, we have to go out and get it. You have to find the resources. You have to connect to those in power. When in reality, we're owed the decency that you come talk to us and that you value our opinions. There's this example I always use in LA where they were fixing an intersection because there was a high number of deaths and injuries. And so they did all the studies, they looked at all the data, and they decided to do a different crosswalk and traffic light treatment. And after they did it, people were still dying. And people were still dying because it was experts coming in, looking at the data, and those same experts, mostly white folks, interpreting that data and making a decision. But after people were still dying, they actually decided to talk to people. And what they learned is that on one side of the street, there was a tree, and the only tree that provided shade, because you can find in a recent New York Times article that sun shelters at bus stops are actually a racial justice issue, that in low-income communities of color, there are fewer places to sit and get shade. And so everyone was on one side of the street under the tree getting shade. And then they would see the bus come and they would try to get across the street. Many of these folks, older adults. And as they were trying to get across the street, that's where the injuries and the fatalities were happening. So sure, you can put a crosswalk at the intersection, but folks aren't going to walk all the way to the intersection because that's not getting them the shade. So you invested all of these resources based on your fancy data scientists, but if you would have just talked to people, you could have made an improvement that would have cost less money and saved more lives. And those are the kinds of examples. It's not incumbent on the grandmother sitting under the tree to find decision makers and say, I want a sunshade or I want a mid-block crosswalk. It's not on her. It's on those folks who come in and say, we're going to spend resources that you help us to have by paying taxes in the way that we see fit without even talking to you, because we've already devalued you before we even engaged, because of the color of your skin, because of your level of education, or because of the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood.
Alex, I see you nodding in agreement. What would you like to contribute?
I love what Tamika just said, especially the "come talk to us" message. That's there is no quick fix for this ceaselessly large issue that we're dealing with here. 400 years of racism isn't going to be fixed quickly at all. But to my white brothers and sisters out there, I would offer the idea of go on that bike ride to the gateway city in your region. Don't drive your car to the middle of the city and bike around. Ride from your community to the city in your area. There are a lot of small cities with an amazingly diverse and wonderful population throughout Massachusetts. Ride your bike, see what it's like to go through the suburbs and get into the city and talk to people. Don't be afraid of, saying hi to that person on a bicycle and say, how's your bike doing? How's your ride today? Beautiful day, stuff like that. That is a very easy first step that you can make. A lot of this, it really needs to be said that it's racism is built on white people's fears and their inability to get over those fears. And there's nothing to be afraid of when you're talking, something as simple and joyful as a bicycle. Get on your bicycle, ride to the city, and talk to people you see. That's a great first step. And don't stop there. Keep making additional steps and trying your hardest to understand what's going on for people in this country, because it's extremely diverse and you'll hear a lot of different answers.
There were several times where you mentioned being stopped by police and them not knowing the law. And we're talking a lot about police reform these days. So what about getting the police to understand what the laws are with regard to bicyclists? Is that a really serious problem everywhere?
Certainly is in Springfield. We have a famously insular city with its own police academy, not accountable to a lot of other places. This needs state and federal level reform. We need outside assistance to come enforce some semblance of responsibility here, because the police are simply allowed to do whatever they like. You can famously read about the 5 officers who were recently reinstated after brutally attacking men of color at a bar recently, and they're back on the force here in Springfield. So while Springfield's incredibly lucky not to have a high-profile murder of a person in color, we are steps away from that with the injustice that we see here. So we need state help to come out to Springfield.
Yeah, and I
One
would
of our,
say it's
go ahead.
I would say it's not surprising that many local bike coalitions, just like when I was at the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition, our education director, Colin Bogart, he knew the law better than many officers. And I think that's true. Folks who are on their bikes a lot and riding their bikes, they often know the law. And so I saw that question about, having more uniform laws, would that help? And like, as a Black person in this country, I just can't say yes, because I've never seen the laws enforced fairly or justly. As someone who has a law degree from Stanford Law School, like, I know too much about the law to think that simply having uniform laws would help. And it's not surprising to me when we see a poll where most of the people say they've only occasionally been harassed in public spaces, when we also see that most of the people taking the poll are white. I think if you had a poll predominantly of folks of color or predominantly of queer folks or anybody who is othered in any way, they'd be like, all the time, people bother me all the time. And it doesn't matter what the law is, if you inhabit a body that is not, considered the norm, then you have that experience. And so as much as I want to say yes, officers enforcing the law around bicycling should be better, there should be more uniform laws, I can't subscribe to a system where enforcement of laws is going to protect me, because enforcement of laws has never protected Black bodies.
Yeah. And I would just want to kind of piggyback on that because, like I say, I spent some time in Germany, and despite there's just a very high level of harassment, at no time did I ever fear for my life when being harassed by officials. And that is a very strong distinction between Germany and here. I think, a lot of the police officers there don't carry guns. And so that kind of also is a very distinguishing factor. And so the police officers there, they know the law inside and out, and they actually kind of use language, I guess you can say, to kind of like, kind of try to talk circles around you to kind of see, what you might kind of give up. But you never, I never really felt like my life was ever in danger. And that's something that, is just a huge difference that, with the way in which laws are enforced in this country, where it's shoot first, ask questions later. It's just the law, you can write all the laws you want, as Tamika said, but it's really not going to make much of a difference.
Why don't we put up our third and final poll question? Has today's conversation changed the way you think about how you interact with others in your community's public space? Lots of interesting comments. One about here in Boston, Patricia says, I've just read the community criticism of Boston's Malnia Cass Boulevard, quote, improvements. She talks about the community needs for tree shade in a heat island area, bike lanes and pedestrian crossing safety were perhaps only tertiary to the need to move traffic. And of course, for those not familiar, that's a really main thoroughfare in the city of Boston. Is this an example, Tracy, of planners not reaching out to people to find out what they really do need?
I think, yeah, that kind of really comes back to, as we kind of think about, this entire conversation, equity is a language. And just like any other language, to really learn it, you have to immerse yourself in it. So there's only so much you can learn from books. And just as an example, I have been studying German for almost 35 years. And I thought I knew it. And so I read German fluently. I could read German law with no problem. I went to Germany, started doing interviews in German, and I had no clue as to what anybody was saying. It took a lot to really understand the context, the nuances of the dialects, to really just kind of be like present in the country, listening to people talk and how they play with language for me to really understand it. And the same thing is true of planning. If you really want to know what people need, you can't just run the numbers. You can't just do surveys. You really need to immerse yourself in communities and to rely on the people who do immerse themselves in communities to be able to truly speak the language. And so whether it's shade, whether it's safe access, whether it's protection from snow. I'm still just frustrated with the city of Boston doesn't plow the sidewalks for pedestrians. And then you get to bus stops and there's a mountain of ice and snow, so you can't even get on the bus. The bus driver can't even get up to let someone on a wheelchair onto the bus because the bus stop areas aren't cleared. I mean, just these kinds of things are things that me as a former architect and now public policy wonk and researcher, these are the kinds of things that I notice because, I'm constantly trying to immerse myself in the communities that I move through. And I think that we need more planners who kind of do this kind of work, not only planners, but also policymakers who are willing to get out of their cars, get on a bike, get out in the communities and really understand what people are having to go through year round. So.
Let me ask one general question of all of you. First of all, the results of our poll, question 3. 78% of you say yes, today's conversation has changed the way you think about how you interact with others, so that's great. 9% no, 13% not sure. But my general question to all of you is, we certainly have recognized the problem, and it's a really tough one, racism, but specifically with regard to cycling and public space infrastructure. What do we do about it? Besides having more programs like this to enlighten people?
I'll just start by saying, again, I had that slide where you have to be brave, you have to be willing to get out of your comfort zone, and then you have to be able to confront power and privilege. And that means really digging in. If you're a person for whom these things don't impact, how do you force yourself to be confronted in them? How do you not just read the Peter Flaxes of the world, but how do you find the authors? There are books out there, How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility. How do you force yourself to confront things that you might not otherwise confront, and really think about the power you hold and wield, and really think about the privilege you have and not feel guilty about those things at all, but figure out what you can do to be a part of finding the solution? Because the opposite of racist isn't not racist, right? You can't say, well, I'm not racist, so I'm okay. You have to actively be fighting to be anti-racist. And just because it seems overwhelming and like, well, how are we ever going to solve this problem? You have to remember, those are those of us who don't have a choice. We live it every day. It is overwhelming. It is exhausting. Welcome. Join this fight with us and push to be an anti-racist.
I want to
Alex?
piggyback
Go ahead, Tracy.
I was about to say, I'll piggyback on that and say, I hear oftentimes people like to say, well, there have been times where, I was the only white person in the room and I felt uncomfortable. I'm like, yeah, but at some point you got the opportunity to go back and you could actually fully relax. You could actually know that, you are in the majority by being white, particularly if you're a white male. And there are times when you don't have to always be on the defensive. And so I kind of echo what Tamika said of, the opposite of being is complacency. It's not about being not racist, it's about complacency. And so to really leverage your privilege and also check it every single day. Because, as a Black person, I'm always carrying the skin with me wherever I go. There's no time when I get to take it off and I get to shed it. And especially whenever I walk out the door, it is something that, just have to be hyper vigilant about. And it's something that affects us each and every single day. And so, I think that, be willing to do the work, be willing to be uncomfortable every single day, and be willing to recognize that some people don't get the level of comfort that you get to actually retreat into.
And Alex, your final comments about what we do to make things better, to improve the situation.
Again, I want to echo Tamika. As a white male in this room, I want to, be as good of an ally as I possibly can be. But it's really the voices of Tracy and Tamika that I want to support here. That the bravery element of these things is really, really key. I'm going to give a shout out to my young brothers and sisters at 413 Bike Life who go out there and ride their bikes in a style that is so incredibly talented. They get out there and they bravely ride in our streets with, thousands of cars, always, potentially causing them harm. That's the bravery that has brought about some discussion here in Springfield, is young people getting out there and doing what they know is right. And I think that the vast majority of white people out there know that racism is wrong, and they need to be braver about it. They need to find a conscious way to get involved and to check their privilege at the door. Come talk to people. It's the only way forward.
Great advice and a great discussion the past hour. I want to thank all of you, Alex Weck in Springfield, Tamika Butler in Los Angeles, and Tracy Corley at MassINC here in Boston. And there will be a recording of this that you can access later if you tuned in late. And we also encourage you to take the survey, the MassINC survey that you see the slide about on your screen. And I mentioned this is the second of our what we call TOD talks, not TED Talks, but TOD Talks, Transit-Oriented Development, thanks to Tracy. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and especially our guests.
Yes, and thank you, Bob and Alex, especially for coming on and having the courage to kind of have this conversation with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Tamika.
Thanks, everybody.